Good afternoon, beautiful people. Welcome to another episode of Kiko's Free Thinkers Forum. This is episode 56, believe it or not, and we're welcome but with a very special guest. His name is Dr. Jack Rasmus. You all remember him from episode 30 on this same Kiko's Free Thinkers Forum. He taught political economy at St. Mary's University in Moraga, California. He's recently retired, and he has a lot of publications on books, journal format, The Scourge of Neoliberalism, Systemic Fragility in the Global Economy. Amongst his other works, he's talked about different types of economical theories, geopolitical topics that we're going to touch on today. He hosts a radio show called Alternative Visions, which is part of the Progressive Radio Network. And so he's here to talk with us again. If you all recall from episode 30, the last time we talked, we discussed an article published in Flashpoint in Ukraine, and Dr. Jack Rasmus contributed to a chapter. It's entitled, for my listeners, if you want to buy the book, you can buy Flashpoint in Ukraine on Amazon. But the entitled article is Who Benefits from the Ukraine Economic Crisis. Keep in mind that was published in 2014, and we're talking about 9 years later. A lot has happened since 2014. But I just want to say, Jack, welcome to the show, and we appreciate your acceptance of our invitation again.
My pleasure.
Yes, still a lot to wrap my head around from the last episode. It's just crazy how warp speed these events seem to be coming in, just with all the new developments, not just with war that we're going to talk about some today, but also how that's going to affect our economies in the world. And we sort of had a premise the last time we spoke about how we are in this together as a world. We can't see ourselves as separate from the rest of the world. And I know that's an easy thing to present, but I think the way some people's mindsets are, they seem to lose the fact that we have billions of people in the world, over 200 nations in the world, and we're just one nation amongst a bunch of different people trying to live, the way we're trying to live. And so in the forum, we had to educate and sort of debunk this Western mindset and sort of let's get towards the world. Let's not separate from the world. Let's join the world and let's discuss together as a world, as we should, as people, be a little bit more civilized. But I wanted to open the floor and sort of let Dr. Rasmus talk about the newest developments in this Russo-Ukrainian war that many would argue that's been going on for closer to 30 years, more so than 9 years, even since the last time we talked. So we want to get some of the newest developments. There's been a lot that's happened. People presumed dead. And I know that he's going to get into that. So just kind of get my audience up to par as far as what is the current state of the Russo-Ukrainian war, and what can we expect within the next year or so?
Well, I would suggest readers or your audience, if they're interested in my views, to go on my my blog, jackrasmus.com. And in January of 2022, in other words, a month before the war began, the hot war began, which was, I think, February 24th, something like that, I wrote an article, 10 reasons, entitled 10 Reasons Why the U.S. May Want Russia to Invade Ukraine. Take a look at that. In other words, what did the U.S. strategically have to gain from provoking Russia to invade? And provoke them they did. For the 6 months prior to the Russian invasion, Russia tried to engage with the Biden administration on a number of occasions to have some discussions about what was going on in the Donbass, the eastern region where the war has been raging. But the U.S. and Biden refused to even talk to them. So the war really begins in late 2021. And, it's no accident, I believe, that Biden rushed the pullout from Afghanistan in August of 2021 because the plans were already in place to engage in this conflict in in Ukraine. And very quickly, the U.S. pushed Zelenskyy to engage in a number of provocative declarations publicly, which kind of freaked out the Russians, about he wanted to join NATO immediately, and they wanted nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And they were all designed to provoke Russia. But there were a number of reasons. I won't go into them, unless you want to recap that, why U.S. had a lot to gain by the war in Ukraine. The most, I'll just mention one or two of them. The most important, of course, was to reestablish its hegemony over NATO. NATO was in trouble under Trump. Trump was, signaling he didn't think much of NATO, and he was thinking of pulling out and so forth, and it was all fractured, politically, and very weak situation. NATO was in trouble, but this war, of course, solidified NATO, and it reestablished U.S. hegemony over NATO, kind of pushed the French and the Germans aside, and because we're really running NATO now is the majority decision, this fraction within NATO of the US and Poland and the Baltic countries and Eastern Europe. They're the guys calling the show and kind of dragging France and Germany along, for the show. Not to say that they're not doing it willingly, of course they are. But the U.S. had a lot to gain. One thing it did gain was reestablished hegemony over NATO, no doubt. And NATO's even expanding here with Scandinavian countries. So that's a big plus objective for the U.S. The other objective, I would say, the other main objective was to drive Russia out of Germany and Western Europe's economy in general. It was becoming too big of an influence economically, particularly in Germany with the pipelines and so forth, and making inroads in other areas, other technology in other areas with the Western Europeans. And the U.S. didn't like that. Considers, Europe its economic backyard. And the objective, another objective of war, was to drive Russia out with sanctions. And of course, that's happened, not just on the energy side of this with natural gas and oil and so forth, but also with, other manufactured goods and sectors. So the U.S. achieved that. And it benefited greatly from that because when they drove Russia out of the energy markets in Western Europe, the U.S. Energy companies stepped in to the vacuum. And the U.S. is now selling natural gas and oil to Europe, albeit at a much higher price than was being sold by the Russians to Europe. So the U.S. oil and energy companies gained a huge market increase in Europe. At the same time, that exporting that natural gas and so forth, it gave the U.S. energy companies the opportunity to say, we don't have the supply at home here, and allowed them to jack up prices at home. So it got two bites of the apple, the energy companies. And of course, the military industrial complex in the U.S. benefited greatly here because the war in Afghanistan, quote, was over. U.S. pulled out, and right away, here comes another war. It seems that whenever we end a war, we start a war. So the military industrial complex does not lose anything. In fact, they're making a hell of a lot more off of Ukraine than they ever made off of Afghanistan or the Middle East, Iraq, etc. So there are other benefits for the U.S. The U.S., in more gets to see what Russia has in terms of technology and weaponry, and thus how to prepare against it. The U.S. gets to test out some of its weapons and equipment, see how it performs, but more importantly, also to see how the logistics of the Russian army functions, and how the U.S. can cooperate with the European allies and function. There's a lot of things that they gain from this war, and are gaining. So strategically, the U.S. has a lot of successes. Ukraine may not be winning on the ground, and we can talk about that, but the U.S. is winning, no doubt, without sacrificing, U.S. troops and so forth, in a whole number of ways. I wrote a follow-up article to that 10 Reasons in the spring of this year, revisiting 10 Reasons why the U.S. wants to just see what the results were after a year. And that's on my blog, jackrasmus.com as well. And then there were a couple other articles I wrote, one on the Prigozhin affair, what was really going on and what are the consequences of that. And I also wrote a piece, I forget the title, but it was really about 3 offensives. So far in the Ukraine war, there have been 3 major offensives. The first being the Russian invasion in February, March. And then what happened was Ukraine mobilized a couple 100,000 more troops over that summer with the help of the U.S. Russia, I think, made a strategic mistake. It thought that a show of force and seizing a couple provinces would bring Ukraine, Zelenskyy, to the negotiating table, and there would be some sort of a compromise. But that actually occurred. The negotiating table was held in April in Istanbul, and an agreement was reached between Zelenskyy and the Russians. No one knows what that is, but it's true. It's been documented. But Boris Johnson intervened quickly and pulled the Ukrainians out of the deal and promised them a lot of U.S. and NATO assistance military, which occurred over the summer of last year. And the result was the Russians were caught off guard. They never intended to take Kiev or anything like that. It was the show of force. And when it was clear that the show of force wasn't getting a deal, the Russians started pulling back from Kiev because they knew a fight was coming. But they didn't pull back quick enough, fast enough. The Ukrainians did not defeat them in the northern provinces there of Ukraine. The Russians were pulling back. And they left an insufficient force in the north around Kharkov and west of the Lugansk province. And the mobilization over the summer gave Ukraine a great advantage, and they took advantage of it with the U.S. Strategic assistance and strategy development. And they did overrun the Russians in the north there in last August, September. So that was the second offensive. Russia then tried to reconsolidate its remaining forces, and it did so down in the south, in the provinces in the south here, pulled back, east of the Dnieper River to consolidate its defenses. Yeah, Russia invaded only with 190,000 combat troops in 4 regions of Ukraine. Now, there's no way you could conquer Ukraine with 190,000 troops, which is really kind of a major division or two in each of the 4 areas, around Kyiv, around Luhansk, Donetsk province, and then Kherson province in the south. There's no way. That was a show of force to intimidate the Ukrainians, bring them to the table, and get some kind of a deal. But it meant that when Ukraine outnumbered the Russians there by this last summer of 2-1, they had about 400,000 troops. The Russians had only 190. Russia's lines on this 800-mile front were pretty thin, and they were easily overrun in the north. And then they reconsolidated, and over the winter, Russia mobilized several 100,000 additional troops and resources, and went on the defensive. And it built its defensive to stop, the advance of the Ukrainians up and down all those provinces. traditional Russian deep defense strategy here. And what we see is the third offensive now since June by Ukraine, which mobilized more. We got this step-by-step mobilization of additional troops on both sides going, but neither side is able to get a massive advantage in concentration of forces. And if you're launching an offensive, the rule of the military is you need about a 5 to 10 to 1 advantage in the troops on the ground to launch an offense, because you're going to lose more in the offense initially than the opponent on the defense. Well, neither side has been able to get that kind of a concentration of forces advantage, except last summer, Ukraine over Russia. And what you got there now is maybe a couple 100,000 active combat troops on Ukraine's side, maybe a little bit more, maybe 250,000 in Russia. Now, Russia has 250,000 more in reserves. This isn't committing, and Ukraine has no further reserves. It's got to mobilize again over the summer here or over the winter. So, when you talk about the principles of war, concentration of forces is really the key. Surprise and mobility and reserves and logistic lines of communication and resources are important too. And classic principles of war apply here in this struggle, and neither side can engage in a successful offense at the moment because they're more or less evenly distributed. Of course, all the weapons are coming from the West here. A lot of strategy on the ground. There are U.S. officers and generals, in Western Ukraine and officers on the ground. A lot of this technical equipment needs U.S. advisors to train and help. And the British, and some others are there, Poles are there. So it's really a NATO Ukraine versus Russia. And the weaponry is pretty much similar, and the troop numbers are pretty much similar. So modern warfare has changed, I believe, as well. You cannot any longer have the kind of strategy that we saw in World War II. A lot of analogies are given by commentators of World War II, in Russia, in the Battle of Kursk and so forth. It doesn't apply. It doesn't apply because the day of these large armored brigades and battalions maneuvering with heavy armor across wide open plains is over. The information and surveillance and reconnaissance technology is so well developed with satellites and all other means that you can see what your opponent's doing very clearly. You can't hide it. And armor is very, I'm talking about tanks and mobile artillery and so forth, is very vulnerable now to smart missiles and smart bombs, smart artillery. And one thing the Russians have had over the Ukrainians has been a big advantage in artillery, a 10 to 1 advantage. They've also had air superiority. So there's no way with more or less even troop numbers that Ukraine can win this without air superiority and with such an artillery disadvantage, and with the Russians entrenched in these defensive positions. It just is impossible. And I think it's beginning to be realized that it's impossible. But the age of, the tank rolling across an open plain, or even ships at sea, they're even slower. And well, I don't know if they're slower, but they're more vulnerable. There's no way to hide on the sea, right? Unless you're under it. And even then, with new technology, everyone knows where everyone's submarines are. In other words, warfare has changed. Technology has changed. The drones are a good example of that. Massive drones now flying on both sides, which makes emplacements of artillery and troops and so forth very vulnerable. It's just a butchering going on there in the East. And with Ukraine trying to launch the offensive, they're all the indications are they're incurring significant losses. Russian some, but significance. I've seen estimates, depending on sources, that the number of dead alone in the Ukraine side is somewhere between 250 and 350,000. Now the Russians have lost maybe 50,000, which is a lot. Think about it, 18 months. We lost 56,000 in 8 years in Vietnam. The Russians have lost it in 18 months, and the Ukrainians have lost 10 times that. This is a slaughter going on. Modern warfare is a slaughter like none other. And I think the US wants this war to continue as it is. I've argued in my articles that what the Biden strategy is what I might call Brzezinski 2.0. Who was Brzezinski? Brzezinski was an East European emigre who came to Canada, then to the United States, got into Harvard, got connected, and became anti-Russian security advisor in the U.S. establishment, and rose from that and became the national security advisor to Jimmy Carter in '79. And his strategy in the summer of '79, as the advisor and having the ear of Carter, he came to Carter and he said, look, let's trap the Russians in Afghanistan. And the US began to destabilize the Afghan secular government at the time. General Najibullah, I think his name was, had led a revolution, kind of like Chavez in Venezuela, or this guy in Niger and so forth. The military tries to throw the imperialists, the colonizers out, and takes the lead in the government. Well, Najibullah was the general. And in July, it's all documented in Brzezinski's memoir, by the way, all this. He came to Carter and he says, let's destabilize the Afghan government. This is like 1980, 79 or 80. It was the July of, I forget which year, but Carter was still president. And Carter went along with it. And they started destabilizing that government in Afghanistan. And Afghanistan, as they had thought would happen, called in the Russians to support. And then the Afghan war was on. So it's a Brzezinski strategy that I believe the Democrats and Biden recall as successful, because it did undermine the Soviet Union, help to bring it down in a number of ways. So I think the US strategy is we want regime change. We want to destabilize Russia, get rid of, so the Russians get rid of Putin. And they looked historically, and well, we did it once. Let's do it again. And I think that's the strategy. And I believe that strategy has been on the books since at least 2016. The Rand Corporation, of course, recommended just that in 2016. This is a think tank in the US that's very highly connected to the US military and politicians, the Rand Corporation. And they put out all these private strategic reports, and they recommended this. And I think it got shelved when Hillary Clinton did not get elected in 2016. It's been sitting on the desk there. Of course, Trump upset so much with all their plans for solidifying and expanding the US global economic empire. And it got brushed off immediately when when Biden won the election. They started activating that plan once again, preparing to within months of his election in 2021. And I think that's why they cleared the decks quickly and kind of sloppily there in Afghanistan, because the plan was to implement this in Ukraine, which they did begin in late fourth quarter of 2021. And we know the rest of the history there. So, very clearly what we've got is a Brzezinski 2.0 strategy, which means the U.S. does not want an end to the war in Ukraine. It wants to continue that war in the hopes, because the war of Brzezinski 1.0 lasted 8 years. I think they see it as an opportunity. And of course, the military industrial complex in the U.S. gets rich in the process. It's not any longer funding Iraq or Afghanistan, but now it's funding, Ukraine. By the way, a lot of these bills that are passed, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars, the U.S. has given Ukraine somewhere between 100 $200 billion so far. Given that, well, but a lot of that doesn't actually go to Ukraine. A lot of that goes from the U.S. Treasury right to the coffers of Boeing and Raytheon and Lockheed and all the rest that are building all this weapons, and they ship the weapons to Ukraine. So that's the way you should think about it. Now, of course, other monies are thrown into Ukraine to keep the economy going. The U.S. got the IMF to give it $13 billion just to keep its currency from collapsing and its banking system from collapsing. The IMF is an extension of the U.S. The U.S. has a majority of votes, and it does what IMF does what the U.S. tells it to do. And by the way, the IMF violated its own rules by giving that money to Ukraine, because it has a rule that says they don't give loans to any country at war. But in this case, that rule was put aside, and they gave them $13.5 billion. And other money has flowed into, politicians in Ukraine and the economy and so forth in Ukraine to keep it afloat. So, 100 to $200 billion so far, depends what you want to put a price tag on, has been given to Ukraine. And that's not counting, of course, what the Europeans have been given, as the U.S. has pressured them to do so. Some of them, it doesn't take much pressure. Poland is one of these countries that really wants to go to war with Belarus and Western Ukraine. Poland always believed Western Ukraine was its area. And of course it was until World War II. The Soviet Union and Stalin took that area from Western Ukraine there, west of Kiev, and took it from Poland and other areas of Poland too, absorbed, Eastern Poland. And the Poles always have thought, well, that's Polish, we want that back, so they're maneuvering to try to figure out how to pull that off. So that kind of sums up my view militarily. Modern technology has changed the nature of warfare. The principles of war still apply, and you can interpret where things are in that regard. Just in this current offensive, somewhere around 50,000 Ukrainians have been killed. Combat troops support, which is massive. And you hear in the media, you read in the media now that, it's a big success, right? That they're penetrating the defense lines. There's 3 major defense lines there in Zaporizhia province, and they've penetrated the defense lines. Well, that's not true. That's the media spin in the West that you're getting. But by the way, Zelenskyy has prohibited any reporters from going to the front lines. So these aren't reports come back from reporters. These are created PR statements by the Ukraine Ministry of Information, and they get picked up and published in the West. And if you're losing an offensive, if the offensive's not winning, then you create a story that it is winning somehow, maybe minimally, which it's been saying, but it hasn't been, they haven't, despite 20 brigades, they haven't been able to penetrate up to the first line. Maybe they are at the first line of defense. There's 3 lines are approaching it because all the fighting has been going on in what they call gray zone between the first line, Russian line of defense, and the lines of the Ukrainian military here. And the fight is going on in these 2 little towns, one called Rabotina, and the other called Verboya or something like that, right? And these are little hamlets, maybe 500 people in Rabotina, and I don't know how many, maybe several thousand in the other one. Well, these are little villages in front, just in front of the front lines, the Russian front lines. Okay. Now, Ukraine is stretched pretty thin with only 200,000 troops to launch an offense along major fronts. It's also trying to recapture the city of Bakhmut, which is a little bit north of the Zaporizhia area, and its lines of defense have ironically also gotten pretty thin in the north, in the Kharkov region, and the Russians are advancing there. So it's another example how neither side has sufficient forces and any great advantage, even having 10-to-1 artillery advantage and air support. The Russians really haven't launched an offensive since the initial incursion back in February, March. The Russians are playing a defensive game. They are targeting military and energy infrastructure, and they're letting the Ukrainians bat their heads against their defensive wall here to wear them down. Now, where I think this is going to conclude is that events in recent days have been pretty obvious here. Zelenskyy is cleaning house. He fired his defense minister, who was a general, by the way, and replaced him with a civilian. And there's some talk of certain generals in the field, Ukrainian generals. The most notable are this fellow Skirsky or something like that, and Zelenskyy. They're the two top generals on the Ukrainian side. They are in constant contact with U.S. General Milley, Chief of Staff, and the U.S. is really trying to get them to implement a U.S. kind of strategy, what the Ukrainians have been only partially willing and able to do. The U.S. wanted them to really concentrate their forces on the southern Zaporizhia area, and they haven't quite done that because they don't really have sufficient forces to do that, I believe. But the firing of Reznikov was the defense minister, firing of Reznikov, I think, and also the arrest of one of the Ukrainian oligarchs. I think his name was Kolomoisky or something, who was very active in financing the Azov and other battalions, the fascist battalions there in the military. He's been arrested, and it's probably the U.S. saying, "Look, you got to do something about these crooks. We're throwing all this money at you, and you're wasting it." So it's a signal, I think, that the U.S. is going to take more control of the strategy and tactics than it even has had up to date. The offensive, I think, is petering out, will peter out in about another month. And the talk that you're beginning to see in the media and so forth is, and the U.S. politicians, is that, look, we've got to have a kind of a halt to offensives. We need to rebuild the Ukrainian army. Once again, there'll be a new mobilization over the winter they're talking about. The U.S. needs to figure out how to provide sufficient weapons and ammunition. To digress, that's been a big problem. Both sides are shooting off about 5,000 artillery shells, Russians maybe more, every day. And the U.S. is only producing 25,000 a month. And it's been using up, and the Europeans are using up their artillery stores here. So the U.S. needs time to figure out how to increase its production of ammunition for Ukraine. And the U.S. and Biden want to have a kind of a freeze in place, and they're trying to get the Russians now to talk. It's a tactic by the U.S. You know, whenever the U.S. is not winning, it wants to sort of let's suspend the conflict, and then we'll come back, and we will come back stronger when we're, you know, want to, and break the contract, break the deal. I mean, it's a long history of U.S. military, right? I mean, look at the Native Americans,
Mm-hmm.
you know, during the Civil War and before, you know, the U.S. With the Plains Indians, to digress here, had a truce. Okay, you know, we'll pull back our forts from the Northern Plains, which they did because of the Civil War. But as soon as the Civil War was over, you know, and they had a treaty, they gave the Lakota, the Sioux, with this huge area for their reservation, including the Dakotas and Montana. But once the Civil War was over, they broke it and came back and started the war again. Well, that's what the U.S. does. You know, the treaties are just temporary deals. That's all. And that's exactly, I think, what the U.S. wants now. It wants a temporary deal with Putin to sort of let's talk. Let's start having negotiations, and let's freeze things in place for a while. But Putin's not biting. Putin knows, you know, because he was hoodwinked back in 2015-16 in doing just that after the coup in 2014, U.S. finance coup. According to Victoria Nuland, we spent $5 billion to pull off that coup. She publicly said that. Then she became the economic czar of Ukraine, and that's when U.S. business flooded into Ukraine. You know, Hunter Biden is only the tip of that iceberg. You know, Putin was hoodwinked with what was called the Minsk agreements, which is kind of like a ceasefire in 2015-16, which the U.S. And the Europeans say, you know, publicly have said that, oh, that was only to buy time to build the Ukrainian military. Publicly, you know, Merkel, Angela Merkel here, the former chancellor of Germany, admitted that publicly, and so did the president of France, Francois Hollande, at the time of Minsk. So the Russians, you know, I don't think they're going to fall for that again. I don't think they're going to agree to a temporary halt and a peace, because the U.S. is already, and the Ukrainians are talking about, well, we need a new, bigger offensive in the spring of 24 or maybe 25. You know, they're talking about 24, 25. I think also Biden does not want to defeat in 24, an election year. You know, it looks like the Russians are getting the upper hand a bit. He doesn't want that risk. He wants to freeze this in place, you know, build it back up and not make it a 24 election campaign issue. And then the plan is to come back with a deeper involvement of the U.S. And monetarily and weaponry and so forth, and rebuild the Ukrainian army between now and then. But I don't think Russia's going to fall for it. Anyway, that's where I think things are going with the Ukraine war here. That's the strategy now, to find a, you know, some kind of a, I wouldn't say ceasefire, but you know, minimize freeze the conflict in place with minimal, you know, kind of like North Korea, South Korea, with a demilitarized zone, you know, and they're lobbing shells back at each other time to time. But to sort of freeze it, to give the U.S. time for the election and to take over deeper strategically and tactically, and retrain the army, build that army, build the U.S. production capacity for a bigger fight, and then come back at 25, because it's Brzezinski 2.0. They're not going away. The U.S. has a lot to gain by continuing the struggle, the conflict. You know, it's all in the U.S. interest in a whole number of ways to do so. Okay, so that's my view on the Ukraine war and where it is at present.
We appreciate that breakdown. There's just so much, so many different directions I could go just based on your explanations there. But one thing I really thought about when you were explaining the current situation right now, on the current war that's going on, is the involvement of the military-industrial complex just in front of you. Just I encourage my listeners. I can't tell them what to do, but my viewers and my listeners, you have to be very skeptical of anything you see on television, because everything is captured by the military-industrial complex. Brzezinski's daughter, Mika, is part of the think tank propaganda machine known as MSNBC. She's on there with Joe Scarborough, daughter of Brzezinski that he just mentioned. John Bolton's all over television. You mentioned General Milley. It's crazy. It's almost like the Bush administration never died. The Clinton administration never died. None of these previous administrations ever died. They just keep the same people in charge. They're just now spokespeople on television now. It seems like it's not a coincidence that these people are all over mainstream media now, giving their analysis.
Yeah. Well, these are the neocons, okay? And they've been running U.S. foreign policy since the late 90s. Okay, so that's that continuity there. A few faces change, some come in, some leave, but their objective is the same. Really, since 1999, when the decision was to reverse U.S. assurances to Russia and to move NATO east. That was a big increase in NATO membership east after the U.S. had assured in the early 90s that NATO would not move east. It did. Basically, Bill Clinton got caught with his zipper open, and to avoid impeachment and conviction, he gave any opponent, whatever they wanted. He gave big corporations all these big breaks, tax breaks, and so forth. He gave them free trade and lots of things. So, and the neocons, he let the neocons in. And then we really saw the neocons solidify under Cheney, in the Bush administration. There are a number of lesser players there in that whole faction, Wolfowitz and others. And then, that group just continued under Obama, different faces. Hillary, of course, was a big advocate. Hillary provoked the war in Libya there, It's documented, she said, I need a war to get elected to show, because she was Secretary of State then. All these other conflicts kept occurring. The neocons have kept us at constant war somewhere for 20, 25 years now. They use 9/11 as the excuse to keep us in constant warfare. And there's one war wound down, another one, picked up, because the neocons really believe that the U.S. Should rule the world, and economically and politically. They believe that. And they believe NATO should not be just a Eurocentric organization. It should be a global centric organization. And its purpose should be to defend and expand the U.S. global economic empire, which the U.S. has had, increasingly expanding it, especially after the collapse of the USSR in '91. So that's what the neocons are. And the scary thing about the neocons is that they believe that a tactical nuclear conflict is winnable. That's the scariest thing. And the main players now are Victoria Nuland, right? Who engineered this coup in 2014 in the Ukraine, and other players like this Sullivan guy, Blinken. They're all, that's the neocon faction that's been running U.S. foreign policy for 20 some years now, and they're very dangerous because their answer to everything is escalate. When their strategy is not successful, they say, well, it's because we haven't really done all we can. Let's do more. Let's escalate, And they really believe, it's documented, they believe that the US can win a tactical nuclear conflict with Russia on the plains of Europe. And that's their objective, because they want to break up. They want regime change in Russia, and they really want to break up, Russia. They broke up the Soviet Union, and now they want to break up Russia. Russia is too big, too rich, has too many natural resources that the West wants. Right? And that's really what it's about. They did a probe there by provoking in 2008 a war in Georgia, which they lost, right, against Russia. And they've been trying to destabilize Belarus and Kazakhstan, which is playing ball with it now, and some other places. So it's constant pressure on Russia, constant pressure. And they're very dangerous. I'm very, very fearful for what the neocons are. And it seems to me that Joe Biden is political putty in their hands, right? They've convinced him about certain things. I think in his current mental state, they can convince him of anything.
I was just going to say that. You took the words out of my mouth and probably took it out of the audience's mouth. I mean, it's absolutely insane. Just if people don't see it now, I don't care if you support Biden or not. Most of my listeners couldn't care less about him. But if you support him, I mean, you have to admit that his faculties just aren't there. I mean, just the Congress right now is just what's actually going on. These are figureheads. That's what they are. They're figureheads, and they just keep duplicating the same strategy, just a revolving door of D's and R's. That's why they don't want any term limits, so they can keep this hegemony going as long as possible. But you mentioned the 2024 election, and you talked about, I was going to ask a question, but you alluded to that about how they may try to halt it until, after the election's over. But we don't know who's going to get in office. We don't know if Jim Crow Joe is going to stay in or if someone else is going to be in office, like a Trump. But I guess my question would be, where does that leave the conflict depending on who's in office in 2024?
Yeah. Well, as long as the Democrats hold the presidency, the war will continue, right? Because the Democrats have got so much invested in this war. They're not, and Biden especially has so much, and maybe even personally invested. We'll find out historically someday that they can't pull out, won't pull out, right? And I think that's the problem we've got, why we're stuck. And they believe that they can continue funding and fighting a protracted war for years there, as long as Ukraine puts up the cannon fodder, which it is. So I think that's the election thing. As I said, the Biden administration does not want a defeat in Ukraine in election year. They want to sort of freeze it, maybe, or maybe that's too strong a word. They want to downplay it until after 2024 election. Then the big offensive will occur once again, I believe. And I think the Russians know that. Now, the Republicans, by the way, 72% poll show 75% of Americans don't want Biden to run. They don't think he's capable, right? I wonder how many percent don't want Mitch McConnell to run either. He's been showing similarities here. What do we got? We got these octogenarians that should be in their rocking chair, writing their memoirs, running U.S. politics, running the system, with the neocons, behind them, really calling the shots, and the big corporations economically calling the economic shots. I've never seen historically such a poor crop of elite leaders the last 2 decades that we see today. And that's probably why the U.S. economic empire is increasingly in trouble. There's other reasons too, but they're not doing a very good job managing their empire right now. They're kind of screwing up politically and economically. Who's going to be the Republican candidate? Who knows? Who's going to be a Democratic candidate? We really don't know, except we do know that the leadership of the Democratic Party is doing everything they can to freeze out any competition. They're not going to let RFK Jr. have a voice, or Williamson, or anybody else. That's why they canceled the debates, right, to protect Joe here. They selected Joe in 2020. They want to keep their selection unless they can find somebody who's just as reliable to replace him. If they can over the next 12 months, well, not even that, they have to do that by March. I don't see anybody else that they're going to bring in. I think Joe is still the candidate, unless something actually happens. Which could, but the Democrats who have been railing against Republicans with all their voter suppression and gerrymandering, which is true, they've been trimming the edges of American democracy wherever they can. The Democrats are just as bad. They don't allow any competition of ideas or anything. They're doing everything they can to keep Green Party and any third party challenges off ballots anywhere legally. Both of them are trying to circumscribe American democracy. They don't, because it's a hindrance. It's a hindrance to their strategy, and that's the reality. In the 21st century, we see an atrophying of democratic rights. Supreme Courts are not, in on the deal too. Politically, the country is going through a crisis here. Now, Republicans very clearly, and increasingly so, Trump is the candidate, right? None of them are able to close any gap with Trump. And it seems the more they go legally after Trump, the more popular he becomes, and he's using it. He's using it to his advantage. Now, I'm not sure, whether they're going to do something to allow him to run or not. There's a real movement that's growing to prevent him from being on the ballot. Petitions, and it has something to do with the 14th Amendment, or one of those amendments, I think, say that if you engage in criminal treason, you cannot run. This came out of the Civil War, you see, to prevent the politicians, Jefferson Davis and all these guys from running again. But I don't know whether they can make that stick in the case of Trump, because he didn't really create an alternative country like Jefferson Davis, and his statements on January 6th are sufficiently ambiguous that it's going to be hard to pin him. And even the January 6th event, they say it's an insurrection. Well, it was a pretty dumb insurrection. It was a riot, no doubt. But what were their political objectives? Was there any organization there? Can you have an objective with a bunch of dumbass Proud Boys, crashing windows? Except naively to think that would bring any change, I'm not so convinced that was an insurrection. Certainly was a riot, but and that's going to make it tough to, unless they've greased the political wheels with the courts, to really stick Trump with treason, and therefore prevent him from running here. And it's a very risky thing. I'm not a Trump supporter, but I don't like the idea of banning people from running for office. That the principles are far more important than the individuals here. And I don't agree with liberals that, to save democracy, we've got to cut it off at the knees. Because once you start doing that, what's the difference from Stalin? Stalin said, okay, you can't run, you can run, whatever, and so forth. What's the difference? What's happened to American democracy when you can ban people from running for your political opponents because you want to win? Well, that's an example of, again, the Democrats going after democracy, just as the Republicans are going after democracy. You know, we don't have a two-party system. We have a single-party system with two wings. One's called Democrats, one's called Republicans. Two wings of, though, I would call it the corporate party of America. And they're in a political food fight, you know, over policy as the empire declines here, over what's the solution to deal with the decline politically and economically. This is a fight within the elite, you know, and the rest of us are being dragged along and lied to and kept in the dark about the facts. I mean, I've never seen propaganda as deep and widespread and effective as it has been. You mentioned MSNBC, but CNN, all of them, they have blacked out any alternative views as to what's going on in Ukraine and so forth from the American media. You can't find even the internet. You know, those who control the pressure points in the internet, which is a big backbone in the phone company. You know, phone company backbone of the internet, and they can turn on and off any IP address they want at that top level of the backbone and prevent Americans from seeing it. And I know of several sources on the internet, global sources, not in the U.S., that I had watched earlier for an alternative view of what's going on in Ukraine, and they've been blacked out. It's not only the mainstream media, TV media, you know, and social media, but I mean, the Americans aren't getting any view except the official view and story, which is mostly falsifications as to what's going on there. I mean, it was pretty bad in 2003. With the invasion of Iraq. Remember that yellow cake and, oh, he's got weapons of mass destruction. It turned out it wasn't true, right? Or even if you go back to 1991, the first Iraq War, remember the way they whipped up public opinion? They said that the Iraqis were killing babies in incubators, right, in Kuwait. Well, that was false too. I mean, this is the way America goes to war. You know, it decides to go to war, lines everything up, and then after the fact, it massages public opinion to fall in line. Well, they are really massaging and stroking public opinion nowadays. You can't get the truth about what's going on unless you know where to go. There are still some places like Telegram channel and so forth that you can find out what's going on. But one by one, the media and the elite have been shutting those down. And I suspect they'll continue to do that.
I guess it is a question in a way, but I really had two observations based on what you just said. One perplexing element of this whole Ukraine-Russia war is I can't recall a time where this is clearly a proxy situation. We're training the Ukrainian army. It's not like we have people like over there just contributing like on the ground. Like we're not losing people, but they are, but with our support, you know, because we're supplying all the military weapons and everything else. I can't recall a time where celebrities and politicians flew in and out of a country so consistently. What it's caused is a lot of skepticism from people because I've kind of just like I've navigated different social media platforms and stuff, and people who would otherwise support Ukraine almost have a second look when they see stuff like that going on because they know it doesn't make sense. Okay, so they're at war with Russia. So how are people able to just go in so easily into the country like that? I understand they may be concentrated in a certain part of Ukraine, but still, it makes people have like a lot of, it causes angst with the people because they know that something just isn't adding up to the official narrative that they're trying to sell to the rest of us. Do you kind of have that sense that people are realizing that this Ukraine situation isn't what they thought it was when they were originally sold?
Well, you know, partly the way propaganda works is you you get people that the rest of the people admire to go out in your position, and because they admire these other people, they say, well, okay, I like that guy, I respect that person, he must have something there, I don't have time, I'm trying to struggle to survive, to dig out all the facts and truth myself. Americans working long hours and trying to stay afloat and everything, they don't have the time to really dig into it like intellectuals do, like you and I do. Not that we're intellectuals. That's kind of a negative word for me, and celebrities, particularly Hollywood, these actors, they're not the sharpest pencil in the box, these people. Just because they're famous, they're on the screen and everything, that doesn't mean that they're misled. They're not misled, the liberals, which of course they are. They fall for the propaganda too, and they fall hard. And who knows what private advantage they're getting from this? I mean, actors try to stay in the limelight any way they can. And they do some pretty stupid things. I mean, Sean Penn, not far long ago, did some stupid things, almost ruined his career. But that's what, a lot of these people going there, they're trying to revitalize their careers to some extent, I think. And to some other extent, they want to hobnob with the elite. They've gotten rich now, and they want to become part of not just the cultural elite, but the political elite, and they're courting entry into the club. So that's what's going on, I think, with some of these celebrities.
I only have one more question about Ukraine, Russia before we transition into the BRICS, which is a very noteworthy discussion. We'll probably do that for about a half hour because I have to go pick my son up from school afterwards. But I was thinking about the Trump component that you added towards the end too, and just how the media works. Even if you analyze like certain parts of Joe Biden's presidency, how Trump was de-emphasized at certain moments conveniently, and now he's re-emphasized conveniently. And the media knows that this is going to cause headwinds. Like, they know that people are going to have reactions to it, whether you hate him, love him, or whatever, because they rely on the ratings. They use him for ratings. They use him for his notoriety. And you see it more and more now. Obviously, the mugshot, that's all people were talking about a week or so ago. And it completely gets silent. Like, you heard nothing about Trump for a while. They were banning him off social media. And then all of a sudden, I thought it was weird that CNN allowed him to be on television for the town hall. Remember that? And people aren't putting it two and two together. So why would they all of a sudden give him a platform just in time for the election cycle? Like, this is all choreographed, and they really, it just proves that they're massaging the populist's psyche, because they basically call the shots, and they're seeing how we adjust to what they're doing.
Well, the Democrats love to run against Trump. He's the issue, the main issue that they have. They believe they won in 2020 running against Trump, right? You run against Trump, you're really saying, forget how bad we are. This guy's worse. That's the whole argument. If you let him in again, everything's going to collapse. So maybe you don't like us, but he's worse, right? They love running against Trump because it allows them to not have to discuss their failures, their policy failures. I would say Biden's strategy is Trump plus let's lie and hype about Bidenomics. All the great things we've achieved, and most of it's a false narrative. I've been doing a lot of research and writing on his economic policies, and we could talk at length about that. But they're running and are trying to spin Bidenomics here, plus Trump, plus whatever else that they come up with. between now and then. That's the campaign strategy. Now, part of it, of course, is prevent any alternative ideas from RFK or anybody from penetrating the public discourse on this. Let's keep these people marginalized, and that's the strategy I see on the Democrat side.
And my listeners, viewers in the forum couldn't agree more with that assessment. That was part of the reason why I created the forum, was to not only spread free thought, give people the ability to think for themselves, but just to show the deficiencies of this one-party system. And that's why I platform people who wouldn't be getting attention otherwise because of the rules stacked against them, the Federal Election Commission, and all these campaign finance rules that are just already coordinated by the two parties to shut out anyone. And I don't know what they did after the 18.9% that Ross Perot got in 1992, but ever since then, there hasn't been any sort of penetration from a third-party candidacy on a national scale to that degree. And they put these mechanisms in place for a reason, to keep anyone that's even close to a threat that could possibly just disrupt the system, not overthrow it, but just disrupt it just to the slightest bit.
Yeah, well, they may have a surprise. It may be difficult for them to prevent a third voice here. Cornel West is running a campaign, and he's going to be on the Green Party, which I think has ballot access in about 20 states. I see the Democrats engaging in some pretty heavy legal efforts to knock the Greens off the ballot in various of these states, because he could upset it for them, and then they'll have the same argument they had against Ralph Nader when he ran in 2000. Oh, he was responsible for the loss of Florida. No, he wasn't responsible for the loss of Florida. The Supreme Court was responsible. And, Al Gore went along with it. There was a lot of hanky-panky going on, counting ballots, and Al Gore just sat back, part of the elite, his colleagues in the elite said, no, don't shake the tree, Al. There's other things for you. Supreme Court stepped in and selected the president. So no, you can't count the votes, right? You can't count. I mean, how blatant an interference in democracy is that? This Supreme Court's a real problem. But as far as third parties, you're absolutely correct. They don't want one. Well, actually, a second party, as I said, and they're going to do everything they can because Cornel West is saying things that people are listening to and say, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Not that I'm a supporter of Cornel West. I'm just independent here, but. Until this stranglehold, this single corporate party of America with two wings is broken, not much is going to be done. I don't think. It's an organization question. And unless you have an organization, you can't expect the American people to really stick their neck out. You can have these uprisings from time to time, which are all, justified, Black Lives Matter, Occupy movement, and so on and so forth. But the elites know how to deal with them. They just wait them out, not just in the U.S., but yellow vests in France and in Hong Kong and so forth. The elites just wait them out, which means that you can't just have these spontaneous insurrections and expect to have any political gain. You need organization to deal with that. And the elites on the Democrat and Republican side know this full well, and they will do anything they can to prevent an alternative independent organization from rising and mobilizing people, because if they ever did, I'm convinced the majority of Americans would jump on that wagon, and then the game would be over for these Republicrats.
Republicans, Republicrats, the same thing. Um, I have one final question again about Ukraine, Russia. If you could briefly touch on what the Wagner Group is, and can we confirm if Prigozhin actually died? I know everything I've read says presumed dead, and they use that like crazy to be like, oh, you see, Putin is this big gangster. So, what do we actually know about this situation with Prigozhin?
Well, it was a private mercenary army, and the whole affair reveals how risky it is to put big capitalists in charge of their own military, right? Uh, the privatization of the military has been going on everywhere. The U.S. has kept, was it Blackstone? I forget the name of it. Our private military. I mean, the CIA and NSA use private military, but they keep them under control. You see, they don't let them. The Russians let this guy run, particularly in Africa and places, and then found him useful when the Ukraine war erupted here. And then they had to tiger by the tail because this guy was kind of unstable. Well, I don't know if he was unstable, but there were some funny things going on between Prigozhin and maybe the West. It was known in Africa he was talking to some people from the West, whether they're CIA or whatever, who knows, right? The problem with Prigozhin was he was getting rich off this war. He had almost a $2 billion per year contract with the Russian military Ministry of Defense, 2 billion. He was getting paid $1 billion to fund his troops, and he was getting something like $900 million because before he got into this role, he was a big restaurateur oligarch, and he was providing a lot of the food and food sources, food supplies to the Russian army. So he had these two big contracts, almost $2 billion. And in March, that got cut off. The Ministry of Defense said, no, we're not renewing your contract. Well, so here was this guy with $2 billion with a private army, and now he had no money to pay his private army. He was getting desperate, I think. And maybe that's why he was talking to other people, he's treating it as a business, a profit center. And also, he was going to be exposed if he didn't have his Wagner troops behind him. And if he couldn't pay them, they were going somewhere else. At the same time, the Russian Ministry of Defense was saying to the Wagner fighters and said, come on, sign a contract with us, with the Russian army, and we'll pay you more. So they were really hitting Prigozhin in the pocketbook. For whatever reason, I don't know, they wanted to pull the plug on him, and he knew it, and he was pissed off with the Ministry of Defense, and he was, saying a lot of things before, his march on Moscow against the Ministry of Defense here. So there was a war going on within the war, political war, the Ministry of Defense and Prigozhin here, and they cut him off at the monetary knees, right? He had, I think that contract ended in like April or May, right? So he had no money. He had no money, and he was going to lose the support of all his troops, which was his trump card, right? So for whatever reasons, it's not too clear. He decided to, quote, march on Moscow. I think he wanted just a big publicity, and he probably thought that his buddy Putin, because they were close, would mediate the conflict between him and Ministry of Defense. Well, he was wrong in that assumption. There's no way Putin's going to go against his military, his army, because Prigozhin is small change compared to that. And plus, how could Putin really cut a deal with this guy after he took his, it wasn't the total Wagner force, it was just part of it. that was very closely allied to Prigozhin, that went on this march on Moscow. And they didn't go very far, but they did, shoot down some Russian planes, and as they went north, which made it impossible for this guy. And Putin was very clever in the deal that he cut, get him out of the picture, send him to Belarus, right? And then who knows where he went? He didn't stay in Belarus. Who knows where he went? And he was reportedly trying to find new customers for the Wagner Group. Well, where are you going to find new customers if they're not in Russia? Well, they're going to be in the West somewhere, or maybe Africa. Who knows? But he was trying to find a revenue flow here, so he could keep his forces intact, right? And then, of course, somehow he got on a plane, and well, who knows who did it? Well, fingers point certain directions is more likely than not. We'll never know. Was he really on the plane? I think he was. I think it's a far-fetched conspiracy to say that he and Putin faked his death. I mean, that's Mission Impossible kind of movie theme, I don't think that happened. I think he's gone. And I think the Russians learned a lesson about private, at least using them so close to home, they may resurrect something like that in Africa, in support of their client friends there in Niger, Mali. You might see it restored, but who knows?
Well, with that information, that clarifies a lot of uncertainties I had. That would make sense that could have been someone within the Wagner Group, could have killed him easily based on, not having that money.
He had a lot of enemies, most of his lieutenants went down with him. So it probably wasn't like he was in the group, but you could imagine certain anti-Putin forces in Russia, which there are very strong, believing that getting this guy to march, on Moscow. And by the way, that happened almost coincidentally, with the launch of the Ukrainian offensive. I don't know if that was just coincidence or whether that was planned. But it could have been some internal sources, because all you had to do is plant a bomb, and I think that's what happened. It clearly wasn't a missile. It was a bomb that was planted there. And someone knew which plane he was on, because he always flies with two planes, but they knew what plane he was on. So it was an inside job within Russia somewhere. Exactly where, who knows? Who knows?
I have
Ukrainians too. Ukrainians have a lot of, they're working closely. Ukrainian intelligence services, CIA, Ukrainian CIA is working very closely with anti-Putin Russian sources within Russia.
I have a final, bigger general question, which will probably take up the rest of the time, because I'll have to leave in about 20 minutes. But I think it's important to at least include this topic, because we can continue the discussion if you come back onto the show, because it's not going to go anywhere. And what I'm referring to is the BRICS coalition, which have 6 new members that are going to join January 1st, 2024. Previously, we already had Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa joined in 2010. This has been a conception since the early 2000s. So it's not like this is something that's new necessarily. We just had a 15th summit in South Africa. If people followed that, it was telecast a lot of places. I know the US media may not have paid as much attention to it, but this was a major event, this 15th summit that occurred in South Africa. We had 6 new members: Argentina, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and United Arab Emirates. Very resource induced countries. When we talk about natural resources, we talk about the population of the world. With those new groups added, I don't know how much that would be, but even with just the five, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, you're talking about over a quarter of the world's population, just in five countries, and a lot of political clout and economic clout as well. And so I guess my question would be, what does this do to disrupt the system here, the Western hegemony, and these talks of de-dollarization with all these different countries jumping on board with this BRICS coalition?
Yeah, well, if you notice, all those countries recently joined are heavily oil producers as well, you know. Well, it marks a real serious challenge to the institutions of the U.S. global economic empire, right? The BRICS expanded the way they are, and I believe others will join. I mean, if Egypt and UAE and Saudi Arabia join, Turkey will eventually join. If Argentina and Brazil and Latin America are, well, some of the Andean and Venezuela will join. And who knows who is going to join from Asia, maybe Indonesia. Okay. So this thing is really becoming a political challenger analog to the US dominated G7 and even G20. Which are institutions where the US and its closest allies get together and plot out their control of the world. The G7 is just a US backyard, obviously, you know, Europe and Japan and the US and Canada. G20 is a little broader. And you've got a number of countries in the G20 who probably will join the BRICS as well and have a position in both, you know, but that's a weakening of US institutions. And what it represents is what's going to happen with de-dollarization. Clearly, these countries are going to try to remove themselves from hegemony of the US dollar. You see, heretofore, most of US trade, virtually global trade, most of global trade, especially trade in commodities and energy, had to be done with the dollar. You had to get dollars in order to buy oil. You had to get dollars to buy, you know, metal commodities and grains and so forth. When you have an expanded BRICS like this, they will have their own currency. We don't know what it's going to look like, but we'll see something fairly soon, probably based on oil. Petro, it'll be a kind of a petro currency with maybe a few, maybe Chinese yuan and petro currency. And there will be buying, purchasing, trading in kind, you know, using their own domestic currencies. It remains to be seen, but whatever happens, it means a big blow to the US dollar. And the dollar is the linchpin of the global US economic empire. If the dollar declines as a trading currency, it will decline as a reserve currency. And if that's the case, countries will want fewer dollars. If that's the case, countries won't want to buy dollars in order to buy US treasuries, right? Because you got to buy dollars if you got to buy treasuries. There'll be fewer dollars, they'll cost more, so they won't want to buy them, and they won't buy US treasuries. Now you follow this trend. If the world is not buying US treasuries, and China is already reducing its holdings by hundreds of billions of treasuries. But if the world is not buying US treasuries, the US cannot finance its annual $1 trillion plus budget deficits. Right? That's how it finances these trillion and a half deficits. We don't raise enough taxes because we're giving all these tax cuts for the rich to cover our expenditures. But other countries will recycle their dollars back to the US buying treasuries. And that's where they get the trillion and a half that they actually end up spending, you see. So the budget deficit won't be able to be covered if the dollar collapses in the world. Now, if the budget deficit already at $1.5 trillion chronically, is not, gets worse, which it will. It's going to hit $43 trillion deficit, national debt. National debt is just the accumulation of annual deficits. If we're going to run trillion and a half deficit, as far as the eye can see, the national debt's going to be huge here in a few years. And that means, well, the US is going to have to cut its spending or raise taxes. The elites don't want to raise the taxes that Trump gave them, $5 trillion tax cuts. The U.S. has cut taxes $15 trillion since 2001. $15 trillion. Yeah. I mean, our debt is 33 trillion, but $15 trillion. Right? The wars have cost us about 7 to 8 trillion. There's 22 trillion right there of the $34 trillion national debt right now. You throw in the social programs for the crisis of 2008-9 and the COVID crisis, and then you throw in pharmaceutical and health companies gouging Medicare, Medicaid, right? There's your $34 trillion right there. They've been able to finance it because the other countries are buying treasuries. When they stop buying treasuries, how are you going to finance it? Oh, then you got to either cut defense or raise taxes or really go after social discretionary spending or even non-discretionary, which means you're going to have to go after Social Security. I mean, these are real crises of major proportions that are around the corner if the dollar collapses as the global currency. If the dollar collapses as the preferred global currency, then you're facing other institutions of the global economic empire in trouble as well, right? Mm-hmm. Right now, the U.S. uses what's called the SWIFT international payment system. SWIFT allows the U.S. to see through the U.S. banks and foreign banks who is violating the sanctions, who is buying Russian oil, who isn't with the SWIFT. But if the BRICS have their own currency, they'll have their own international payment system, and the U.S. will never be able to see who's violating the sanctions. I think that's why a lot of these countries that do oil are very interested in joining the BRICS, because there's going to be a currency based on oil, right? And they can do what the hell they want, buying and selling, trading with each other. The U.S. won't have any idea if the sanctions work. They hardly work now anyway, but they won't work. Now that's a big weapon, direct weapon, sanctions of the U.S. empire. In other words, it's gone. That weapon is essentially gone, right? And then you got institutions like IMF and World Bank, and there will be those parallel institutions already, an IMF-like BRIC institution that will loan money to other countries to protect their currencies. I mean, it's almost, you got to have an IMF-like institution if you have an alternative currency and payment system. They go hand in hand. Well, now what you're seeing is the collapse of the institutions of the global economic empire of the United States. History will show that Biden accelerated this process through his sanctions and war. Biden has done more to destroy the U.S. economic empire than Russia or anybody else could ever have done. That's why I say the neocons are so stupid. The neocons are so blind in their policies that they're destroying their own empire. I mean, as far as economics, they're ignorant, or they know it and they think geopolitics is more important, you see. So, that wraps up my sort of analysis of the BRICS. It's the symbol, the harbinger for all these other things that are going to follow suit, because there's the BRICS, right? Mm-hmm. And the key is it's going to undermine the U.S. dollar as the global trading and therefore reserve currency, which sets in motion all these other crises, like how do you finance the deficit? How do you finance the debt, right? And if you get keeping interest rates, the Fed is keeping interest rates, by the way, up 5.5, it's going to rise. The interest rates are going to go up. I'm saying that further. But what about the interest on the debt as part of the annual deficit? In 2019, it was like $250 billion a year. It's $600 billion now. and it's going to 900 billion. So you can just imagine, you can't sell your treasuries to get this dollar flow back to cover your deficit. And that deficit's ballooning because of war and because of interest on the debt going through the roof, right? And what are you going to do? You take it out on the American people with their social programs? Yeah, but that can't even come close. You got to have to raise taxes on the rich, you know? Campaign contributions, they're not going to do that either. They're between a rock and a hard place, I think. And we are on the edge of an acceleration of the decline of the empire for these reasons. Fiscal and monetary policy are in deep crisis. They're not working very well. And you got increasing income disparities going on. This quote recovery, we can go into that, we don't have time, is really a fake. This thing that these Bidenomics talking about, all things are so great in terms of jobs, inflation, and what inflation is going to creep back up. Already we could see it happening. Global crude oil is approaching $100 a barrel. It's at 92, approaching $100 a barrel. They can't get services inflation down. Services report in the U.S. just came out today. Services are expanding, they're not contracting. The next CPI report will show even higher services inflation. Services are 80% of the economy, U.S. economy. They've been stuck at 5 to 6% inflation rate for 4 months now, and now they're going to creep back up. And now energy prices are going to creep back up. The Fed has raised interest rates to 5.5%, and this is what they got for it. They're going to have to raise it a hell of a lot more. But if they raise rates a hell of a lot more, they further destabilize the regional banking crisis in the U.S. So monetary policy is full of contradictions, and so is fiscal policy. But it's all an indication, reflection of the decline of the empire.
Okay, I lied. I may be able to sneak one more question in because I'm just so curious about. Thank you so much for those details. We appreciate it. So with the BRICS forming the way it is now, and for sure there are going to be way more countries interested. There are lots of countries interested in joining this coalition. Does that de-incentivize or incentivize the military-industrial complex, or does it even matter at that point if the BRICS solidifies into what we think it could become?
Well, I don't think it makes that much difference to Lockheed and Raytheon and Boeing and these guys. I mean, they're looking at the profits of the next year, and they may be looking beyond. Who pays? Who buys their stuff? Well, the U.S. government buys their stuff. Is the U.S. government going to stop buying their stuff? Not as long as the neocons keep the U.S. in perpetual war. The U.S. will continue buying this stuff. That's a problem for the politicians. They'll say, you guys figure out how you're going to get the money and who you're going to squeeze to get it from. Just because you got the BRICS, it doesn't mean that these BRIC countries won't also trade with the U.S. It won't mean the end of the trade. It would just mean that the terms of the trade are not such that the U.S. is the big gainer. These countries are now going to get a bigger share. I mean, that's why these generals in West Africa are throwing the French out. I mean, France, over half of France's energy is nuclear. Where does France get, its uranium? Niger. How much was Niger getting for the uranium it sold to France? Pennies on the dollar. They were getting squeezed out of it. The Niger politicians were in bed with the French. Who knows how much they got, right? So Niger says no, and Mali says no, Burkina Faso says no, and now Gabon says no. I mean, this is a prairie fire going on in Africa, and that fire is going to spread. And it's really about, hey, maybe we politically decolonized years ago, but economically, France and the West, you guys have kept us in economic neocolonialism, and we want a share of that. We want more for ourselves. And they look at Venezuela and they see Venezuela having done that under Chavez and gotten a better deal for the sale of its oil, and it's benefited the people. So Africa is moving in the same direction, saying the same thing. I think that's the reality, and I don't think Exxon gives a damn. Exxon is going to make its money one way or another. And Raytheon's got to make its money one way or another. They'll just raise their prices for Uncle Sam, to maintain their profit margins. Yeah, they'll pay more for the resources, but they'll just pass it on, because they're monopolies. They're oligopolies, as we call it in economics. They just pass it on. And they're well positioned in Congress because of campaign finance and lobbying and so forth. I mean, how many lobbyists we got in Congress? I don't know, like 50,000? There's 50,000 lobbyists running around. Don't tell me that these 535 guys and women in Congress aren't getting a cut. It creeps out once in a while. But anyway, that's my take on the military-industrial complex. Very powerful, along with the banks and big pharma and a couple other in techs, a couple other industries. We have an oligarchy in this country run by these people. We have a facade, the appearance of democracy. Even that appearance is beginning to fragment. But we have an oligarchy running the show, controlling the politicians, and who are doing in their benefit. I mean, how could you get 15 trillion in tax cuts? Most of it going to the 1% of the corporations. Maybe 12, 13 trillion of that, right? $8 trillion that Brown University estimate of war spending, depending on can't pass any audits, right? It's getting 850 billion a year, just the Pentagon, and that's not counting overseas contingency operations, i.e. actual payment of military. And it's not counting other areas of U.S. defense spending, which is stuck away in these cubby holes. I mean, like the U.S. military is the biggest consumer of energy in the world. Well, where is its bill for its oil costs? It's not in the Pentagon budget. It's in the Energy Department budget. Why aren't veterans benefits and veterans affairs considered part of the defense budget? No, it's not. It's in the social programs budget, right? So if you added up all these cubby holes, NSA and CIA and State Department and Homeland Security, all this stuff, you got 1.1 trillion minimum per year in U.S. defense spending. 1.1 trillion. How long can we continue that? With $34 trillion in debt going to 40 trillion, with interest on the debt 900 billion pretty soon. This is an economic crisis. And if they lose the empire, whoa, what is this, right? This is Britain in 1945 when they lost their empire. This is Rome in 4032 when it lost its empire, 432 AD. The barbarians took over the agricultural surplus, in France, Spain, and North Africa, and then the empire had no money to pay its soldiers anymore. That was the end of that, right? So the U.S. is on the same trajectory, I believe, and it's not as if it's going to happen overnight. It's going to be a protracted development. But the BRICS, alternative currency, alternative economic institutions, sanctions, the war, all that, monetary policy, fiscal policy not working as well. All these are too many indicators of the elites are in deep trouble.
Well, I think that you said a lot there towards the end. And I can't wait to replay this episode tonight. Beautiful people. This episode will be released very soon. probably at the end of the day, and you all will have that information. But I wanted to ask Dr. Jack if you have any final words from our audience, but we would really appreciate your presence here today.
Yeah, if you want to follow my day-to-day commentary on politics and economics, things that are happening, follow me on Twitter. I'm at Dr. Jack Rasmus. That's DrJackrasmus. Follow me there. Join me there if you're on Twitter. For a little longer analysis, this is my website, as I said, jackrasmus.com. And every Friday on the Progressive Radio Network, my radio show, Alternative Visions, airs at 2 p.m. New York time. So go to Progressive Radio Network, Alternative Visions, and you can check me out there. I also post a link to that, and we'll post a link to this show and other interviews that I have on my blog, jackrasmus.com. So that's where you can find, what I'm saying here about current events.
Beautiful people. I encourage you all to tell your friends and family, interested friends and family, to subscribe to Kiko's Free Thinkers Forum. Revisit episode 30 with Jack Rasmus, and also this episode 56. From the forum to you, we want to say thank you again for joining us. And we honestly can't wait to have you back on if you're willing to come back on, because this is an educational forum, and we appreciate your knowledge that you have to share with us.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. In particular, I think it's timely to discuss, the falsifications about Bidenomics and the state of the U.S. economy right now, both jobs, inflation, and so forth. That's a show in itself, and I think some of the facts and data and analyses that I might raise with you would be very useful, interesting to your audience. So if you want to do another show in a couple of weeks, whatever, let's do. Is Bidenomics real?
That sounds absolutely wonderful, because October, we may be able to squeeze some people in, and so I think that may be a great to have an economic theme, especially with the holidays all lined up the way they are in the system. Consumers relies on consumers to basically keep everything afloat. But yes, we will talk very soon. Again, thank you, beautiful people. Take care of yourselves, and we'll talk soon. Okay, we have S.L. Kanthan from Bangalore, India. We're going to talk more about BRICS this Saturday. So stay tuned to Kiko's Free Thinkers Forum on your favorite podcasting platform, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, our official YouTube channel. Have a great day, everyone. Cheers.
Bye-bye. Send me a link.